Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, Margo Azzarelli and Marnie Azzarelli, authors of Labor Unrest in Scranton.
Our guests are Margo Azzarelli and Marnie Azzarelli, and they are the authors of this book, Labor Unrest in Scranton. Margo, we'll start with you. Why'd you write the book?
Well, I rewrote the book to preserve the history. That's what we do.
What gets you interested in it?
Labor history, I don't know. I've been interested in that for about the last decade, and I've been researching the riots for a long time. I can't really say one specific thing that gets me interested in it, but I've always been a history buff.
Are you a native of Scranton?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
And Marnie, how'd you get interested in this project?
Well, mostly because my mother was interested in it, and she hasn't stopped talking about the riots for the past decade. And so I grew up pretty much throughout my teenage years listening about the history of Scranton, and it just kind of got me interested in wanting to know more and more about where I live.
And you're a docent, it says in the book?
Mm-hmm.
Doing what?
I'm basically a tour guide at the Lackawanna Historical Society, and I just bring people through the house and show them the different exhibits there.
Well, for people who've never been to Scranton, first of all, where is it? How big is it? What's going on there?
Well, Scranton, I'm not really good with directions. We're northeastern PA. Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area, Lackawanna County. It was known at one time as the anthracite capital of the world. Now we don't have one basic industry. It's just a plethora of people. We have about, our population's about over 100,000, so around there, yeah.
And you mentioned the riots. Why don't we just get right into it? Set the stage for the riots.
Well, the riots, you asked me one of the reasons that fascinates me. It's because it happened on Lackawanna Avenue in Washington at the intersection. And it's a corner that people walk every day. It's like the main corner of downtown Scranton. So nobody had really, the majority of people never knew that a riot actually happened there. 1877. That was a really violent year for labor. It began with 1873, the Panic and Depression, when Jay Cooke, he went bankrupt, and he was one of the biggest bankers at that time, and he financed many of the railroads, and railroads were growing, and he overextended himself. So when he went bankrupt, a lot of other banks felt the domino effect of it. So being a capitalist, instead of taking the brunt of it, unfortunately the workers kind of took the financial brunt of it, and their hours got cut, and their pay was getting cut 10%. I mean, Pennsylvania Railroad cut the pay in 1877 twice in 1 year. I mean, they were making so little, $27 a month, if that, and it was getting cut more and more. So after that last pay cut in 1877, in June, they decided they were going to walk out. So July 16th, the trainsmen in the B&H, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, they just stopped. And all of the railroads except for one were blockaded. They just stopped running.
Oh, it wasn't just the Pennsylvania Railroad?
No. It started with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So that was the beginning of it. And with the railroads, once they stopped, you couldn't ship any other things, like iron and the coal, because you needed the railroads to get from point A to point B. So that's how the coal miners also went on strike eventually by the end of August. or by the end of July, I'm sorry.
In 1877, how organized were unions?
Not very
much at all.
That's what they were trying to, and not very. It was kind of the prelude. I mean, they had done several attempts to unionize, but they were stopped at every attempt that they were doing. They had the Knights of Labor. It was just the beginning, and they had the workmen.
The AFL, was that going then?
It was
American Federation of Labor?
Samuel Gompers. That was more the 80s. But you had the Workmen's Benevolence Association, and they weren't making any headway. The capitalists were too
powerful.
Yeah,
Was there somebody who said, okay, we're going on strike, or did they take a vote, or how did it
I think they just all got disgusted with the loss of wages and the loss of time. I mean, some were working only 3 days a week, and like I said, similar to today, even though they were taking pay cuts, the capitalists and their workers they're getting dividends and hikes in their dividends. So kind of, history repeats itself, as they say. The working man usually gets it, and woman. So, so they just united and they said that was it. They were just going to stop.
So they walked off the job, and then what happened?
Well, then, pardon the expression, all hell broke loose, actually, and nobody could go anywhere. They didn't really bother. The passenger trains were still able to go up until the end of July. But riots broke out everywhere. Here in Altoona, Pittsburgh was the worst, in Scranton, of course. So it was a lot of unlawfulness throughout that whole month.
Your chapter about the riot is called Bloody August 1st.
Yes.
What happened on August 1st?
That was when the riot occurred in Scranton. The Brotherhood, the tradesmen went back to work on the 31st of July. They didn't get anything. They were kind of bullied, by the upper-ups, that if they agreed to go back to work, nothing would happen to them. They would keep their job. They weren't going to get the wage increase. Well, the coal miners, they weren't too happy about that. So in Scranton, the Mayor McCune, had thought he had convinced the coal miners that they would go back to work the next day as well. And a meeting was set. The officials of the coal miners was set for the Roundwoods, which is a section in Scranton, in West Scranton. And that's where most of the meetings were held between the Miners' Committee and the miners. Somehow between that night and August 1st, the morning of August 1st, somebody changed the meeting spot to over by the silk mills. And so that's where everyone went, except for the committee of miners. Other people gathered around the silk mills August 1st. There was a lot of unfamiliar faces in town because along with the riots in various places, strangers kind of turned up and wanted to start trouble and things like that. So that was a pretty heated meeting that went on for a couple of hours. And it was a hot day. It was like 99 degrees at 10 a.m. in the morning. And somebody came forward, they never knew who it was, with a letter from W.W. Scranton, who was superintendent of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company. And of course, that's who Scranton's named after, his family. And it was a very negative letter saying he would have them work for 45 cents a day.
Yeah, I want to read this from your book. The contents of the letter claimed that he would cut wages of the working men down to 35 cents a day and make them work even if it put his body under a comb pile.
Yes, yes. And nobody ever knew if that was a real letter or not, which most people assumed it wasn't. But there was just enough people there who were already agitated. It was just like I have in there the perfect recipe for a riot. They just decided that was it. They felt betrayed by the tradesmen. They went back to work, and they didn't want to do the same thing. So they took off in different directions, heading towards town, which is Lackawanna Avenue, was considered the heart of the city. And they went to the furnaces, and they were pulling people out of work. And so they claim, because there's a lot of different interpretations, there's a lot of different accounts of exactly what happened.
So how did the fighting start?
Do you want me to continue?
No, you continue.
Okay.
You know this better than me.
Well, the fighting started once they hit the intersection of Lackawanna and Washington. But before we get to that, Mayor McCune, who was in his office that whole month, he never left. He wanted to have a special police force just in case, because he had heard of all of the riots and he was afraid the same thing was going to happen here. Well, the council vetoed that. They didn't want a special police force of businessmen. He felt that was going to encourage violence if they did something. Well, the people themselves, the businessmen themselves felt they needed some type of protection for the city. So they did form, on their own accord, it was called the Scranton Citizen Corps. And it was about 116 members of the Scranton Citizen Corps.
Were they like vigilantes, or
No,
were they authorized by the city?
They had the backing from the mayor, not the council. But they were just businessmen, young men that were in college, law students, things like that were there. Unfortunately, a lot of people did get stuck out of town. We were only down to like 11 policemen because they were sent to help with the other riots, and they couldn't get back in once all of the trains were stopped. So a lot of people were stuck out of the city. So that's why they needed more men to defend it. And they were drilling. I mean, they did drills at night, what people didn't know they were doing. They were learning from a lot of the old Civil War veterans, were teaching them how to march and use the guns that they gathered, just in case. Well, they were caught off guard because they thought with the trainsmen going back to work, they were okay. Well, that wasn't the case so much. So Mayor McCune was alerted that there was a crowd, they say between 3,000 and 5,000, coming up. It's a small area, so you could see it, coming up the hill towards the city, the downtown. So he leaves the office by himself because now everybody's scattered that was in the Citizen Corps because they thought everything was pretty cool, you know. And he walks down himself to that intersection. And a few of the Citizen Corps that were available did gather. And some of W.W. Scranton's Iron Police. There was 24 of them and 25 of the Citizen Corps. And they were ready to defend the city. So they kind of clashed in the middle of the intersection. It was just Mayor McCune and a priest that he picked up along the way for support, Father Dunn. And he asked them to cease and desist. But that's not how they wouldn't listen. So they said a man in a black duster, that's how they describe him, who's later is found out to be Patrick
Lane?
Yes. Came forward, and he wanted to know who he was. He didn't know he was the mayor, I guess. And he's the one, they supposedly started the problem with getting the people all anxious to fight. And when he came upon the mayor started talking to him, and then he punched the mayor in the mouth and knocked him down, broke his jaw, and the priest went down with them. So that was kind of when the clash began.
You quote the mayor as saying, let's see, members of the Citizens Corps gathered. Mr. Scranton made a speech advising the men to shoot low and shoot to kill if they shot at all. And then at some point you say the mayor says,
fire.
Fire.
See, I can't understand that. If
he
his
broke his jaw.
is broken, I don't know how he was able to speak. So as I said, these accounts are kind of goosey there. Yeah, I'm not sure. But actually, I take most of the riots from Samuel Logan's book that was written only 10 years after it. So that was the closest thing written to the actual account. So
were there newspaper accounts?
yes, there was newspaper accounts.
What do they read like?
Pretty much close to Reverend Logan's. There's some inaccuracies in it as always, and of course the paper was for the capitalists at the time.
It was still biased at that
It was
point.
also, they were also accused of inciting a riot, kind of playing one side against the other. Of course.
Was the mayor sympathetic to one side or the other?
He was trying to defend the city and end it peacefully. I think he was. I mean, nobody knows what's in a man's heart, truly, so I can't say for sure, but I don't think he was trying to be for both sides. He was trying to see both sides, but I think his job was mainly to keep the city at peace and from destruction, from Pittsburgh. I mean, they had so much destruction It was unbelievable.
Oh, they had riots in other cities too?
Yes. Pittsburgh being they had over $6 million worth of damage. For as much damage, 20-some people were killed, 26 people were only killed, considering the damage. They burned everything down, and they claim it took to the 1930s to pay off all the damage. So.
How many people were killed in the Scranton riot?
4 that I can trace. There could be more.
Some say 6.
Some say 6, some say 3,
but
it was,
can't name them. So.
Yeah, it was definitely 4 that I can trace so far. And I still haven't given up because I still research it.
Did the people scatter then, or did the fighting continue?
Within 3 minutes of the first shot fired, the people all scattered. So they don't know how many more could have died, because if they admitted they were there, then they were part of the mob, and they could be arrested. So, yeah. Nobody in the Citizen Corps was killed. 2 were wounded, but none more, none were
that's because
killed.
the miners, they only had cudgels and things
they had,
I don't think they had
clubs.
guns.
I don't think they had guns either, but one can't be sure. Yeah.
Did the strike end then?
No. The strike went on until October. Unfortunately, they didn't win. They went back to work after that too. But
what was it like being on strike then?
Well, being the way things were, I mean, I can only imagine how terrible it was. I mean, they barely had enough.
I was going to say, the miners barely had any money to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, like
and now
I
they
said,
had nothing coming in.
They made $27 a month, if that.
Yeah.
Most of that had to pay for their housing from the company store. They had to buy their own goods from the company store.
They had to buy their own tools from the company store.
So they didn't really have much left over. Probably whatever they could grow in their garden. I mean, they rarely ate meat. That was a rarity.
Later on, different unions would try to help, but that's still like a barely surviving.
So it's called the Great Railroad Strike, but how many coal miners were involved?
In our city, there was a couple of thousand, I would say. Yeah, in our city.
Because all those industries were so tied up with each other.
Yeah, they were all tied together. The iron, and like I said, with the shipping, without the railroads, they couldn't ship anything. So it kind of, like the domino effect, it affected everyone.
So how was it settled? Did the miners just go back to work? Did they get anything out of it?
No. The New York Times said, even though the miners lost, they call it a battle drawn, because it was the first time in history that the poor conditions that the miners had to deal with, the working conditions and the wages, was known nationally. It actually got national attention. That was the first time. So even though they didn't win anything other than getting their jobs back, they did have somewhat of a win, the knowledge of what was going on.
Were the Pinkertons involved in this?
They would become later on. W.W. Scranton hired them because he thought people were trying to kill him. So they hired the Pinkertons.
I wonder why.
Yeah, but the Iron and Coal Police, they were involved with the Citizen Corps the day that they shot. And a lot of people accused W.W. Scranton and the men for shooting hastily. So they got brought up on charges, murder charges.
Oh, they did? Oh.
They weren't, of course, they were able to post bail because they were all rich. And it took, 45 minutes, they were found not guilty because nobody showed up on the prosecution, on the defense side. So, yeah.
What do you know about W.W. Scranton? And do you know how many generations he is removed from, say, Governor Scranton?
Let's see, there's possibly 2, I think. I can't be sure.
Because they're all named William Scranton, right?
So. Right.
Yeah.
His father was Joseph.
William Walker.
His father was Joseph, and then William Warren. He was William Walker. So possibly 2.
And what was his business?
He was superintendent of the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, which was started by the Scranton brothers, the Scranton Iron Furnaces. That's what it's known as.
So the city was named after the previous generation?
Yeah, his father and the Selden and George. That would be his uncles, correct.
So how did you get involved in this project?
Well, mostly through my parents are living historians. We've all been kind of doing research and presenting programs since I was about 12. So I've always been kind of just entrenched in the Scranton history. So when she asked me if she wanted to do a labor book with her, I'm like, well, sure. And she's done how many books before this one? 5? And I've helped scan pictures and do things like that, but I never got a chance to help write one of them. So this was a big experience for me.
How'd you divide up the work?
Well, of course, she took all of 1877 because she knows it, like, by heart. And I focused mainly on the strike of 1902.
So 1877, what was the life of a miner like then?
You can.
Well,
tell
I did that
them.
chapter too.
She did do the life of the miner.
Like we said before, it's not like how much did you say? $27 a
If
month,
that,
$1 a week, maybe, possibly. Where the coal miners lived, most of them were immigrants from, in the beginning, Wales and Ireland, and then later on more European countries like Poland and Italians. That was more of the 1880s. But during that time, everything they owned was basically owned by the company. They lived in a company town. They lived in a company house. They went to the company store. Even the church was owned by the company. So their whole lives were just tied into paying back the debt that they usually owed the company from getting their tools and what they needed to work in the company store. Not to mention working for, how long, 12 hours?
Oh, yeah,
12
12-hour
hours a
days.
day, deep, because this is deep vein mining, not strip mining. So it's deep into the ground with, like, I think I'd get claustrophobic at that point because it's just how many tons of dirt and soil above them. And they would stay there all day long, eat lunch down there, and come up at night. And that was basically their day.
And they only saw the sun on Sunday.
They only saw the sun on Sundays.
Did any miners like their jobs, or did they just see it as a living torture?
I don't know if I would say it was a living torture. Again, you don't know exactly. It differs from person to person. But in the company towns, a lot of the same ethnicities lived together. So all the Germans lived with the Germans, all the Irish lived with the Irish, all the Welsh lived with the Welsh. So they still did all their traditional holidays, traditional festivals, and they kept up the camaraderie, even deep in the mines, even going so far as to other miners of different ethnicities talking to other miners. They would just tell each other stories as well as they could in whatever language they could.
Did different ethnicities get along?
It depended, I think.
Not all the time.
Not all the time.
Was there a hierarchy where sort of one ethnic group was higher up the ladder and other?
I would say the
groups?
Welsh,
in the
because
mines.
they came over from Wales as skilled miners, because they worked in the coal mines in their own country, and the Irish were the
They're
more
laborers.
unskilled.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Welsh were usually more of the bosses over the Irish at some points.
And I see your last name is Azzarelli. Were there any Italians there at the time?
In the 1890s, the Italians.
Yeah, 80s
were,
and 90s, and they were
yeah.
treated awfully.
Yeah.
What was the role of the wife of a miner?
Cooking.
Doing everything with the house, including keeping the coal dust out at all times. They would make everything. They would make the curtains, the bed, hopefully they had a metal frame. If not, it was just on the ground. They would make the rugs in the house. They would make all the food. They would take care of the garden, take care of if they had any like little bits of livestock like a goat or any pigs or anything they had. They would take care of the shopping. They would take care of pretty much everything, including family if they had children, which was,
They had
of
a lot of
course,
children.
yeah, they usually had a lot of children. They took care of the children until they could go off and work.
When did the kids start working?
Ooh, some young as 5 or 6,
7.
5 or 6,
Yeah.
usually.
Those are the
that's
boys.
The boys.
Yeah, the boys.
What would a 5 or 6-year-old boy do in the mines?
They would be a door boy or a nipper, where they would have to hold the door open so the miners can go through different parts of the vein. And they had to stay awake and stay alert because the mules would come through and they won't stop. So they had to keep that door open. And
Unfortunately, there was a lot of accidents where if they fell
Yeah.
asleep and the door opened, yeah, it wasn't good.
What would 5 or 6-year-old girls do?
Well, they didn't really work. They would work in the silk mills, but later on. Not that,
yeah,
not
I don't think it was that young. I think
that
it may
young.
be around 9 or 10 they would
Yeah.
start working in the silk
Silk
mills
mills.
as bobbin girls and weavers and keep going through that.
Silk mills were real big at the time?
Yeah.
Where'd they get the silk?
Usually in New Jersey, Patterson, New Jersey. Yeah.
So what would they do at the mills?
You could answer that one.
This is a little off topic.
I haven't looked at this in a long time.
You played a silk mill.
I know I played a silk mill girl, but they were to be in charge of getting the bobbins filled with thread or making garments later on, I think.
When did
Making the
you
clothing
play a
garments.
silk mill girl? What was that?
Oh God,
That was your first?
Was that the first thing I did?
Your Hitler Youth was your first thing.
Okay, we don't have to go about the Hitler time I played a Hitler Youth.
You mentioned in the back of the book a theatrical production that you had.
Yeah, we did a
been involved
play
with,
in
Margo.
2007.
Yep.
We did the riots. We did 1877 riots on Lackawanna Avenue.
Well, we tried to do the riots, but we had mostly girls. So it
they
was
were
girls dressed
as
up as coal
boys.
miners trying to be writers.
And we actually did it at the iron furnaces, which was nice. So we had the great background, great setting. So we had a nice turnout. It was very nice, and it was the first time that people in the area actually learned about the riots that occurred there. So.
If you go to that intersection today, what do you see?
A sign.
The PHMC. Yeah, we nominated a sign. So in 2008, they approved it, and we now have a sign for the coal.
And it's also a
miners.
Pokestop.
And labor strike. Well, I'm sure people love that. So it's right there.
So did things settle down? Everyone went back to work? Everybody was content after that?
No, I wouldn't say content. There was still off and on riots throughout the end of the 19th century.
And the unions were having a difficult time trying to gain any footing in anthracite. Because a lot of the unions worked for the bituminous coal mining, like that's in Illinois, and I forget where else. Illinois, Arkansas, I think.
Yeah.
In those areas, but it's a different type of dynamic with the anthracite coal, because that was more in demand at that time. So product had to keep getting pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed out.
For people who don't know, what was the difference between anthracite and bituminous? Why is one different than the other?
Bituminous soft coal.
Yeah, bituminous is a softer, dusty, it's very ashy coal. Anthracite's the cleaner burning coal.
It's harder.
Yeah, and it's harder.
Well, when the railroad strike happened in the anthracite mines, that shut down the bituminous mines also?
I don't believe so.
I don't think so.
No.
I think anthracite was still more predominantly used at that time.
So let's go to the 1902. Was that the other strike? And that's your chapter?
Yes.
Set the stage.
Well, it really started in 1900. At the time, John Mitchell was the president of the UMWA, the United Mine Workers of America, and all the miners wanted at the time was a 10% wage increase, and for the union to be recognized as a union by the coal operators, which they adamantly refused to do. And at that time, William McKinley was trying to be reelected.
President.
Yeah, President William McKinley trying to be reelected. And he didn't want a strike to happen because he saw what was going to happen. He knew there was going to be a strike, and there was a bit of a strike for about 6 weeks or so. And at that time, he didn't want there to be an issue where he either had to take either side, and he didn't want to look like the bad guy. And
He wanted to win.
he wanted to win, basically, he wanted to win re-election, so he sent out Senator Hanna with J.P. Morgan, who put pressure on the coal operators to concede. So there was a 10% wage increase at that time, and the strike ended. But throughout 1900 to 1902, the union still wasn't recognized, and the coal operators didn't really care about the concession they made. They saw, like, they were humiliated that the coal miners got their way. So they decided not to keep the contract sound. And they completely, they went back to the regular wages. They didn't care. They still treated the coal miners as they treated them before. And Johnny Mitchell didn't want to have another strike in 1902. He just wanted to try to compromise with the coal operators. But the head of the coal operators, George F. Baer, did not want to cooperate whatsoever. He was, because of their loss in 1900, he was adamant about never conceding to the coal miners again. So, of course, a strike had to happen. So in June, is it June? Yeah, 147,000 miners went on strike.
It's
May.
How would they coordinate it where they all agreed that we're all going to go on strike? And weren't there some mines where the workers just said, no, we're going to keep working?
There were some that did that, and the UMWA actually helped to keep some of them open during the strike because we still needed coal. Whether or not the operators would compromise or not, we needed coal to survive at that time. But there were people like Mother Jones and different union organizers that would go from town to town and live with these people and make sure they joined the union so we could all be a united front at that point when the strike happened. And most of them were. I think 8,000 to 10,000 coal miners went back to their home countries, but a lot more of them still stayed here living on that bare minimum level throughout the 6 months of the strike.
So what was the strike like? I mean, would they set up picket lines and carry signs, or just sit in their houses?
Well, the thing with the strike is that they had to make sure that the coal mines were closing down. And at that time, operators were hiring non-union scabs, which is what they called them, or blacklegs, who went in and did the work that for the miners that were on strike. So they would go to the front lines and try to stop the non-unions from going into the mines, or try to destroy the mines even, because there was a lot of the non-union members or non-union workers were unskilled. So they didn't know how to work the fire pump, the water pumps, or how to control fires. So a lot of destruction and disasters were happening. There was about $2 million worth of damage throughout the 6-month period. And the coal miners are right there trying to keep the non-union workers out. And then the coal operators hired the coal and iron police, that happened also in 1877. Most of them were out of not from the state. I think New York was a predominant place. They were given $1. Was it like $1 a week or something like that as pay, and they were to protect the mines. And that's where a lot of clashes happened. But surprisingly, only 7 people died throughout the 6-month strike.
Now, the miners were living in company-owned houses and buying from the company store. So what did they do when they were on strike? Did they keep living in the houses?
Some of them would get kicked out of the houses. I mean, it would depend.
That's why the unions were trying to help them to survive, but they barely had enough to help them to survive.
Yeah, if we're on strike for 6 months not having any income, how do they eat?
Mostly probably from their own gardens and cattle, and I'm guessing they rationed out for different families and things like that.
Probably a lot of them didn't eat.
Yeah.
So it's hard for us to imagine, I mean, you have to do what you would have to do to get by.
That one income is what kept a family of sometimes 9 or 10 or 11 people going, and then suddenly it's not there.
What time of year was this strike?
From May to October.
So it was starting to get into the cold when people needed anthracite.
That was a concern.
Yeah, that was a big concern, and that's why Theodore Roosevelt, who was our president then, got involved, which was unprecedented. Most presidents were like McKinley. They didn't really want to be involved. They wanted the strike just to end. But Theodore Roosevelt wanted a compromise of some sort, because he knew it was just going to keep going on and we were going to have a coal shortage if we didn't have a compromise.
And winter was coming. So They needed to push forward.
They needed the coal.
Well, this would have shut down other industries across the country.
That's what he realized,
Did they have to shut down? I mean, the steel could
I don't think it went that far.
It went 163 days, but it didn't go that far yet before they stopped.
I think 1873 was still more of a panic than 1902 was. Roosevelt stopped that because he knew it was going to happen again.
And the violence as well, because Johnny Mitchell didn't want 1902 to end up as violent as 1877. So
he kept a tight lock on most of the leaders of a part of his union to say, don't do this. You can do your protests. You can try to get the non-unions to stay out of the mines, but don't be violent.
But unfortunately, that didn't always work, because even with the Latimer massacre, that was in 1897, they were the United Mine Worker Unions. Again, they were on strike, but it wasn't a really well-known strike at the time. But they were just kind of protesting, and they were just walking peacefully. A group to Latimer and Luzerne County sheriffs and the Iron and Coal Police. Disrupted the crowd, shot into the crowd, and many people died, and they weren't doing anything but marching peacefully.
That was right near Hazleton.
And they even told them, don't carry sticks, walking sticks, nothing. But it didn't matter. And people still died for no reason.
Who ran the Coal and Iron Police?
The coal barons.
Yeah,
it was all the companies.
Whoever the operator hired them independently, I would think, for each coal mine.
They had no regard for the laboring class at all.
And was there public opinion about the 1902 strike around the country? Were they for one side or the other?
Well, this was the progressive era where things like labor issues became a very hot button issue in our country. So people started to pay more attention, and media coverage was actually right for the laborers this time. It wasn't for the coal barons, because George Bear, who was the leader of the coal operators during the strike, he wrote a letter saying that it was his God-given right to be a coal operator. And that rubbed so many people the wrong way that they went over to Johnny Mitchell, who was a very clean-cut, very polite and courteous man, and just did not want anything to do with George Bear, who was considered rude and arrogant.
Did you read a lot of newspaper accounts about the 1902 strike?
As much as I could. Most of it is now, there's one really nice book that has a bunch of essays within it that have a lot of excerpts from the newspaper chronicling the time.
That was the good thing with 1902. There's a lot less than 1877,
yeah, there's a lot
unfortunately.
more readily available information on 1902.
Because there's some newspapers you could tell were clearly pro-miner, and some newspapers were clearly pro. Is that kind of a fun read?
It is, because it's nice to see who was on what side, basically, because you can tell the ones that were against the laborers would talk about how violent they were during 1902, which they weren't that violent, and it was usually of equal violence from both sides, but they always kind of pitted on the laborers of being the more violent people, even though half of them probably didn't even have a gun or a weapon with them.
Well, even to that extent, in some of the history books, the one author, both authors were at the one meeting for when they formed the Citizen Corps, and it's the same meeting, but you hear two different sides of the story, even though they were both at the same meeting. So it's just funny because everybody's take is different on everything.
You mentioned John Mitchell a couple times, and he was the head of the union?
Yep,
UMWA.
Was it?
Yeah.
And how did he? Who was he? Tell me about him.
You wrote about him more than I did.
Well, I always think it's funny because he was born in 1870 in Illinois. His parents died when he was young, so he had foster parents. But he was only 7 when the strike of 1877 happened. So I always find that kind of funny because he was just a little boy, and then he ends up being one of the big labor heroes, you know. He worked in the bituminous mines in Illinois, and he joined the Knights of Labor, but he didn't stay with them because they did a lot of unsuccessful strikes. So he wanted to move on, and he joined the United Mine Workers of America. And he really moved up fast in that. And so much so that he wanted to come to Pennsylvania to see what was going on because he heard about the poor working conditions and the low wages. And there was a lot more accidents here than in the bituminous fields. So that's how the 1900 strike started. He took his concerns back to the commission, and he told them, and that's when they did the first strike in 1900. So he was a very he comes across from everything I read. He's very passionate at what he did. Unfortunately, his family suffered from it because he was away more than he was home with the family because he was working to get better working conditions for the miners. But he was just very passionate and very criticized at the same time.
Why was he criticized?
Well, a lot of people think that he was hobnobbing with the rich, and he wasn't in the trenches like Mother Jones was.
She was a big one that would be outspoken
but
about that.
They were friends because I even read letters between the two that you can read online, and I mean she would call him his comrade. Even for as much as they conflicted, they were still friends. You know, they were still working for the same cause. They just had different ways of approaching it. You know, and maybe he was hobnobbing. I don't know. He was just more of a. I don't think he was more of a violent. He didn't think he could get things across with violence.
It was more politics with him.
Yeah, I think he just had a different way.
What was Mother Jones' approach?
The more she lived with the miners and ate and drank with them and helped, like she was right in the trenches with them. So she was more, I wouldn't say violent, but she did get arrested more than a few times, and once was arrested for, I think it was going to commit murder. She had a very colorful life when it came to helping get better worker conditions.
Especially for the kids.
She was definitely with the children in the silk mills.
She was on the older side at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she lived to be in her 90s, right? 93, something like
Somewhat. Sometimes that's a little disputed. She made herself older, or because she wanted to be Mother Jones, appear as a mother. She had the white hair and the black clothing, and like a motherly look to her. So she made her birth date to make herself older at the time.
Unusual.
She started off as a teacher, correct?
Yeah, she was a teacher in a convent. Then she was a dressmaker in Chicago, and that's during the Great Chicago Fires where she found the Knights of Labor, and that's where it kind of just propelled her into that world, and that became her family.
So the 1902 strike was going on for months, and Theodore Roosevelt got involved. Did he have any authority to do anything, or did he just have to try to persuade people?
Well, the operators couldn't say no when he invited them.
The government was going to take over the mines if they didn't sit down.
His ultimate threat was, I'm going to send the army in, and that was going to hurt both sides. So they had to find a way to compromise, or else.
So you write about a big summit meeting that Roosevelt called, and who was there?
Well, there was George Bear and John Mitchell for the miners.
Carroll, right?
Yes, he was part of the commission.
And what's his name? Morgan.
J.P. Morgan?
J.P. Morgan was involved to help with make the concessions for it,
Okay, but
he wasn't directly. He always seems to be on the outskirts, just trying to nudge the coal operators to do what he says, because he had a lot of stock in the anthracite fields at that time.
Did John Mitchell, was he the only one representing the miners at the meeting?
Yes, but also Clarence Darrow, the famed lawyer, was speaking for the miners as well. He did the closing vote.
The committee.
The committee, yeah.
Yeah, he has a chapter in your book. Well, what should people know about Clarence Darrow? How did he get involved in the Pennsylvania mining?
Well, he was a criminal lawyer, but he also did a lot of a labor lawyer. He represented Eugene Debs for the Pullman strike, even though Debs, he lost, but he somehow became known as a labor lawyer. So I'm assuming that's why Mitchell went and got him to defend the miners.
What would the conversation have been like in the room? Is there any account of who said what to who?
Well, we have the closing account of Darrow's.
There were like 1,000 written notepads of what went on at that time. And I kind of skimmed through most of them online, because I think they have all of them like transcribed if you look for them online.
And then
you can see what was going on throughout the entirety of the commission hearing, which took place in the county courthouse in Scranton.
County courthouse. Yeah.
What was the commission?
It was made up of, I forget.
That's
I think
the
it was
Wright Commission?
I don't know. Carol did the Wright report for
1902. Yeah, this was the strike.
This is the strike was it arbitration? I think that's the right word, commission. And it was mostly made up of people that the coal operators tried to pick, which were mostly eminent people that would listen to the coal operators. And John Mitchell, of course, had his reservations about this and told Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt was able to get, I think, a laborer under a different title into the commission hearings, and also a bishop. So those were the two people for the laborer side, basically. I think it was 5 or 6 people.
It was a combination.
Yeah.
It was a fair combination.
Yeah. And
so
they tried to.
The deck wasn't stacked
No.
in one side of
They
it.
tried.
They tried.
But no, it wasn't.
What were the recommendations? What did they end up agreeing to?
They wanted a 20% wage increase. They wanted to be paid by the tonnage instead of just by the cartload. And they also wanted an 8-hour workday instead of 10 hours, because that's how much they were working at that time. In the end, though, the commission found that while things were pretty bad for the coal miners at that time, they weren't truly terrible enough that they couldn't have a standard American living for what they considered a standard American living. So they met midway. It was a 10% wage increase. It was still done by the cartload instead of the tonnage, and they worked 9 hours a day instead of 10. But the union still wasn't
they weren't recognized
by the coal operators. I don't remember. I think I read it when the union was recognized, but that was far later on than it should have been.
You say in the book that John Mitchell took some criticism for having accepted or been too willing to concede.
Mother Jones said he backed down.
Mother Jones wanted the coal operators and the laborers to be face-to-face with each other.
Yeah.
That's what she wanted, but that was never at that time going to happen. And I think John Mitchell understood that we have to take what we can while we can for now. It was like it's almost like baby steps to making it a better place.
Plus, again, he didn't want the violence either.
Yeah, because it would have made the strike longer. There would have been more deaths. There would have been a coal shortage. It probably would have gotten as bad as 1873.
So when John Mitchell said go back to work, did the miners all go along with it, or were there some holdouts?
They all went back.
Once they at least got something, they went back.
Did he have any opposition within the union for hardliners?
I think he did. He eventually ends up leaving in 1908.
I think, yes.
Yeah, 1908. Yeah, like I said, he was criticized a lot. For as much as he was loved, he had as much criticism. Yeah. So again, they didn't think because he didn't get everything that they asked for. But I'm a fan. So.
Buried in Scranton?
Yes, he's buried in Scranton.
Cathedral Cemetery.
Cathedral Cemetery. And the reason he's buried there is because he felt his biggest triumph was in Scranton for the 1900 strike. And that's why he's buried there.
And well, we just touched briefly on the 1900 strike. What was that about?
Well, that was how long did that last?
6 weeks.
6 weeks, yeah. And he did get what he wanted for that. That was because it was the political year, the presidential year, and McKinley wanted to win. So he felt that was one of his biggest triumphs. So,
and it led to 1902.
Yeah. They always say that was a skirmish just compared to the Battle of 1902.
But even 1902 was more civilized than any other battle that went on for labor.
But I guess he had a soft place in his heart for Scranton, because I mean he wasn't from here, but yet it's where he's buried, and we honor him every year still.
On what's the date?
It's October 29th, because that's when the 1900 strike ended. So every October 29th we gather around. We have a Johnny Mitchell statue in our courthouse, and we gather around, and we have a nice little ceremony for him. Yeah.
Why are you a fan of his?
Because what he's done for labor. I'm a fan of anybody who defends labor. I mean, I know you have to have both. You need the capitalists and the labor for the world to continue. But there's got to be a compromise. One doesn't have to be greedy. You can work together. You can always work together. But I think labor built the country. And without us, where would the capitalists be? But you could say the same thing, too. Without their money, where would we be? So we need to work together, not against each other.
When did the United Mine Workers finally get recognized by the mining companies?
I believe in the 1830s.
1930s.
1930s. Sorry, I'm always in the 1800s.
She's always in the 1800s.
She's in the 1900s. I'm always in the 1800s. They asked me when I was born. I said 1865. So.
You look good.
Thank you.
Did the strike change things for the miners? I mean, after it was done, did their conditions improve? Did their lives get better?
I think so.
It did. It opened, not 100%.
Quickly.
Yeah, it did open a door for better, like the child labor laws and things like that. It gave us more of a foothold to make a better place for the laborers.
And other laboring unions were recognized.
The silk mill workers,
silk mill, electric.
The trolley car workers after a while.
So it led into that too.
Could the miners get ahead by being miners? I mean, could they have such a life that they could give their children a better life, or was it one cycle after another?
I think for them to give their children a better life was to get them an education to get them out of the mines. I don't think you could really get a better life in the mines. It wasn't like there was room to move up.
And that happened more later on, too.
Later on.
Because during the 1800s into the 1900s, it was send your child into the mines, and they were going to stay there for the rest of their life.
So they didn't go to school at all? Then?
They probably got like a little bit of an education, maybe, until the family needed the money.
If someone goes up to Scranton now, is there evidence of any of the, what do you see? Is the mining industry still going on? Is there still?
No, we stopped in about 19. Sorry.
We're in 2016, right? Okay.
Yes. 1950s, it kind of started to drift off. So no, there's nothing. There
was like
really.
a prevalence during World War II, and then it just kind of waned off from there.
Yeah, the Knoxville mine disaster.
And oil became more of a better fuel at that time.
Is there any evidence of it? If you go up to Scranton now, do you see any evidence that there was a mining industry there?
We have the mine tour.
Yeah, we have a coal mine tour up in McDade Park.
Yep.
Right below the Anthracite Heritage Museum you can go right into the mine and see how dark and dirty and damp and what these men had to work in. And cold. It's always 50-some degrees.
I think
all
it's
year
55.
round. 55 degrees
like
all
that,
year round down
54.
there.
Yeah.
And you said you do some work with the Anthracite Museum?
We both do. She's on the board of the Anthracite Heritage Museum.
And you do the Lackawanna History.
I do mostly the Lackawanna
Lackawanna
Historical Society.
And is that a museum?
Yeah, that's in the Catlin House in downtown Scranton. It's tucked between two university buildings, so you can miss it sometimes, but it's a beautiful building built in 1912.
If someone goes there, what do they see?
They see the architecture of that time period. The architect was Edward Langley. And if they go inside the house, they'll see different rooms that were in the house at that time because it was a residence.
They do have the coal mining room.
And
upstairs.
they do have a coal mining, upstairs they have a coal mining room, is it a coal baron's office? Which that's always an interesting one because it has a humongous desk and a beautiful topographical map of where the coal veins are in our state. And there's also different rooms like for dresses and for Civil War and for trains and for toys.
And you're involved with a different historical society?
With the Anthracite Museum.
If you go there, what do you see?
They have a lot of
they have a whole
beautiful
1902 exhibit too.
Yeah, they have the
1802?
1902 exhibit. So you'll see a lot of Johnny Mitchell, and they'll tell you the facts about the strike up there. You'll see what it was like where they changed, the miners' changing room because they had to hang their clothes up so the mice and stuff wouldn't get in.
They have all the silk looms. They have a whole
so you would
room
learn
of
about
looms.
the silk mill girls. Yeah, it's very nice.
And you'd see more about the different lives of the ethnicities living
the different
in the area.
immigrants at the
Yes.
time. Yeah.
And you said this is your fifth book?
That's actually my sixth book.
Fifth book. Well, what are some of the other topics of the books?
I've done Scranton Through Time, which is a look about Scranton then and now. I've done different sections of the city. I've done Green Ridge and Taylor. Taylor was a big mining town, and Old Fortune Music. So I tell the history of different sections of the city.
If someone has never been to Scranton, why should they go?
The history itself. I mean, Scranton was really booming at one time. I mean, the saying was, not just with theater, but if you could make it in Scranton, you could make it anywhere because the train would stop in Scranton before it went to New York, so the theater people would get out. But we have beautiful architecture. That's one thing that people miss. You need to look up when you're in Scranton because it's gorgeous.
I think they just had a thing for that.
Yeah, look up Scranton.
Look up Scranton.
Right, and the iron furnaces, I mean, that itself is a gem. We were on the forefront of the Industrial Revolution with that, and that's still there. Part of it is still there. But we have a lot of historical attractions, and it's just a nice place to come and visit. And we have Steamtown National Park. That's nice in itself.
Do you have coal miners in your genealogy?
My great-grandfather was a coal miner. He actually died of black lung. Yeah.
In the Scranton area?
Yeah.
Do you have another book you're working on?
Fingers crossed. I'd like to do we want to do the medical history of Scranton because there's a lot of that. And
it's a lot of it that's not really documented.
Yes.
The medical history.
The medical history, yes.
And now that we have the Commonwealth Medical College there, there's just so much.
We have that. We have 3 different hospitals right
Yeah.
in the city. There's so much history.
There is a lot of it, so we won't know till next week, but fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with that one.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Margo Azzarelli and Marnie Azzarelli. They are the authors of this book, Labor Unrest in Scranton. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.